Thank you very much for joining us for the Language and Identity series at Tokyo College University of Tokyo. In this series, we discuss what identity is and how it is related to language. My name is Maria TELEGINA. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College and a moderator of this meeting. Today, with Professors Sven OSTERKAMP and FACIUS, we will discuss identity and Japanese language from the historical perspective. Sven OSTERKAMP is a professor of Japanese language and linguistics at Ruhr University Bochum. His research interests include Japonic historical linguistics, the early history of European studies pertaining to East Asian languages and scripts, early East Asian collections in the West, as well as the typology and history of writing systems. FACIUS will give a brief comment on Professor OSTERKAMP's presentation. Michael is an associate professor at Tokyo College, University of Tokyo. His research interests are broadly in early modern and modern cultural history of Japan in its regional, transnational, and global context, with special interest in changing patterns of knowledge exchange and circulation and the history of language and translation. Now he's working on a book project called Beyond Edo, Transnational Narratives of the Early Modern in 20th Century Japan. Today, Professor OSTERKAMP will talk about script choices as means of indexing identities in late Edo Japan. Contemporary Japanese writing system with two syllabic alphabets, characters, and also use of Romaji or Latin alphabet provides a lot of opportunities for expression of identity or addition of extra linguistic context through script variation. But in this talk, Professor OSTERKAMP will discuss script choices in late Edo period. It is roughly late 18th century to mid 19th century. At that period, the range of opportunities for the script variation was even wider. And I'm really curious to learn about the history of this issue. So, Professor OSTERKAMP, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And let me just share my slides. Okay. Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me, and a big thank you to the organizers for making this happen. So my title is, as you have already heard, Script Choices as a Means of Indexing Identities in Late Edo Japan. So my focus will be more on script rather than language issues, and time-wise, I'll roughly be dealing with the last 100 or so years of the Edo period. So okay. So the outline for today is quite simple. I'll first have a look at the changing domains of script use, especially of hiragana and katakana. After that, we'll proceed with some issues of intra-script variability back in the days when we didn't have a standardized writing system yet, chiefly in the case of hiragana. And lastly, I'll address further modes of inscription involving entirely different scripts, for instance. So let me start with something that is pretty well known in the literature, namely what I would like to call the pre-modern hiragana versus katakana divide. What I mean by this is the opposition that formerly existed between what is sometimes referred to as the realm of hiragana and the realm of katakana. Unlike today, where the average Japanese text features a mixture of both kinds of kana plus Chinese characters and maybe other things, the choice between hiragana and katakana used to be an either-or issue from their beginnings in the early Heian period onwards. Script choice was closely linked to language choice, and that was still the case in the late Edo period. So for instance, the neoclassical variety of literary Japanese was virtually always written in hiragana plus Chinese characters, whereas the sinicized variety of literary Japanese used katakana instead. Again, plus Chinese characters, a lot of them actually. In other words, the latter variety of literary Japanese, the sinicized variety, which was shaped by translations from Chinese to Japanese, remained to be written in katakana, and thus in the kind of kana that originated from the same context, the glossing of Chinese texts. Both script and language choice in turn also correlated with intellectual contexts and text genres. Unsurprisingly, in view of its origin, katakana used to be associated with things Chinese. So sinology and most other fields of science, Buddhism, and so on, but also from Meiji times onwards, and chiefly up until the mid-20th century, katakana was also the default kana used to write the language of officialdom, starting with the Meiji Constitution and all sorts of law texts, for instance, some of which even made it into the 21st century. Hiragana, in contrast, was the default in a sense, covering not only classical poetry in prose, but also popular fiction, popular science books, as opposed to more technical works for specialists, and so on and so forth. It was also typically learned first. While the realms of hiragana and katakana had long been separate, it has been pointed out that sentence internal mixture of the two kinds of kana became more common since Edo times. So from the late 17th century onwards, for instance, we see colloquial elements in popular fiction being written in katakana, although the text would otherwise be in hiragana. Also from the early 18th century onwards, loanwords in text from Dutch or Western studies contexts started to be written in katakana. Now this may already sound quite modern, but for long this remained just one option out of many, and even up until the mid-20th century, the link between loanwords and katakana, for instance, had many exceptions. Such sentence internal mixture also competed with mixture on different levels on the same page, for instance, for different languages, or also different varieties of Japanese. As an illustration of the basic divide, let's compare two texts by the same scholar, namely Motoori Norinaga is one of the foremost scholars in the field of so-called national learning, or kokugaku. He's writing here in two different personas, as it were. On the right, we see one of his works on classical Japanese poetry, which itself is written in what we may call neoclassical literary Japanese. And as you can see, it's printed in cursive script throughout, featuring cursive Chinese characters and hiragana, two or more of which are often linked together. If you look closely, you will notice one or two instances of furigana added to Chinese characters, and these are actually in katakana. This is commonly seen and will reappear in the slides later on. And ultimately, it is a reflection of the fact that it is katakana that are associated with glossing Chinese characters, well, which is basically what furigana is all about. On the left, it's the same author still, but now katakana is used, and the language incorporates many elements that have their origin in translations from Chinese. So this is thus an example of what I've termed the sinicized variety of literary Japanese on the last slide. And there's a reason to all this, namely that this is a work dealing with the kana orthography of Sino-Japanese readings with traditional Chinese phonology in the background. So it's more or less a sinological work. Again, if you look closely, you will notice that there are actually a few hiragana in there as well, fulfilling the function of italics or quotation marks. Even up until the middle of the 20th century, this actually works in both directions. The main text would be written in one type of kana, and whatever is supposed to stand out from the surrounding sentence may be set in the other type of kana. This may or may not be about loanwords, and even if loanwords are concerned, they can also be written in hiragana, especially if the main text is in katakana already. So again, suggesting that these links, as we know them today, are not necessarily that old in all cases. Here are two further examples illustrating another kind of division of labor between the two kinds of kana. The image on the right is taken from the same work by Motoori as before, but this time it's a page from the main text. Poems from the Kokinshu are given here first, making use of hiragana and cursive Chinese characters. The translations of these poems into contemporary Japanese, however, are written in katakana. The same sort of distinction, that is hiragana for classical Japanese, but katakana for contemporary colloquial Japanese, is also seen on the left. This is some sort of dictionary which allows you to look up classical expressions via the colloquial equivalents, the latter of which are given in katakana again. Now, does this mean that katakana was generally associated with the colloquial language? Certainly not. Popular fiction was printed in hiragana, and scholarly text in sinicized literary Japanese were in katakana virtually without exception. But as the other kind of kana that remained, After the main type of kana for a text had been decided on, both hiragana and katakana could be pressed into service for quite different things. The overall situation at the time is thus rather complex, but it's beyond doubt that opting for either of the two types of kana as the basis of a text was a sociolinguistically meaningful act, understood both by authors and readers alike. Now, in the first part, I've spoken of kanji, hiragana, and katakana, but are these really valid categories when we go back in history to times predating the modern standardized writing system? To some extent, at least, the answer to this is clearly no, and projecting these modern script categories is too simplistic. Projecting these back into history is too simplistic, as I'm now going to illustrate in the second part on intro-script variation. First, it is important to understand that up until the end of the 19th century, we are dealing with open-ended scripts. Until some time into the Meiji period, woodblock printing remained the default technology used in printing, so that not only manuscripts, but also prints gave writers the greatest freedom imaginable. There's in general much less to say about katakana in the period under consideration, so I'll concentrate on sinographs and hiragana in the following. So let's first have a brief look at sinographs, or Chinese characters, if you like. Sinographs do not necessarily equal sinographs, as there's variation on several levels, most importantly here in terms of script styles. Up until the 19th century, cursive script is to be considered the de facto norm in many domains in Japan, and it's strongly correlated with the use of hiragana in both manuscripts and prints, unlike today. The reason for this correlation is rather obvious, as hiragana developed with cursive writing as its model. Cursive script is also seen with katakana sometimes, but this is mostly limited to manuscripts and is not usually the case in prints. Regular script or block script, on the other hand, was largely limited to sinological and other scholarly writings in Japanese, and it was also the de facto norm for Chinese texts in print, apart from prefaces and the likes maybe. In terms of kana, it strongly correlates with the use of katakana, especially in print. While this is perfectly normal nowadays, sinographs in regular script were originally rarely seen together with hiragana, simply because the two do not match in terms of cursiveness. But the co-occurrence of regular script with hiragana chiefly comes into existence, and this chiefly happened from the 18th century onwards, starting with popular editions of medical texts and slowly spreading from there. Other script styles were much more limited, so that clerical or seal script, for instance, are besides calligraphy typically only seen in peritext, that is title pages, prefaces, postscripts, and so on. So here are some illustrations of the correlations just mentioned from different editions of the popular dictionaries known as FACIUS. Originally, character dictionaries typically made use of regular script paired with katakana, and this was also the case here in the beginning, but already around 1600, editions for a wider audience start to appear that are in cursive script throughout, replacing the katakana with hiragana on the way. And if we look at how it developed afterwards on the left-hand side, we see that up until the late 19th century, such popular dictionaries very often featured cursive script with hiragana in the first place, but supplemented in smaller size by the respective characters in regular script, this time plus katakana. Now, as for hiragana, we may again say that hiragana does not equal hiragana. At the time under consideration, we are simply not yet dealing with a small, standardized and codified set that leaves little room for variation. In the first step, we may distinguish between commonplace as opposed to more elaborate hiragana, or put differently between unmarked versus marked ones. Such elaborate or marked kana may have the same base character as commonplace kana, but taking a less abbreviated form, typically in line with cursive script as practiced in China. Alternatively, they may be kana with base characters that are different from those of commonplace kana. Now, these elaborate varieties are typically seen in paratexts to larger works, as has been pointed out in the literature a couple of times, but likewise in works of calligraphy, for instance. Some scholars have also noted that a rather special selection of hiragana used to be employed by scholars of Kokugaku or national learning. So now, what's so special about script use in the field of national learning, especially from the late 18th century onwards? Basically, I think we can summarize the relevant issues under two headings. The first being what I would like to call script purism. Script purism in and since Motoori Nobunaga's Kojiki then covers a number of phenomena that all have in common that they are attempts at restoring at least an imagined, maybe a real older stage of the writing system. For instance, it has been pointed out that there are some unusual kana, the choice of which is in part based on the Kojiki or other works of old Japanese literature. And such unusual kana includes so-called dakuongana, that is kana that are specifically used for syllables with voiced obstruent initials, such as ga or za, da, ba, and so on. We may also observe efforts in avoiding so-called kungana, that is Chinese characters used as phonograms, but with sound values based on Japanese words. So in effect, one would exclusively use so-called ongana with sound values derived in some way or another from Middle Chinese pronunciations. Much later, but even then only rarely we see even attempts at restoring the old Japanese vowel distinction. So what we get here is an orthography based on the phonology of Nara period old Japanese, but with the visuals of later hiragana. Finally, it has been noted that some authors, such as Hirata Atsutane and his followers, made deliberate use of obsolete forms of sinographs, and so it's not just the kana, but also the kanji in the text that would give you that feeling of antiquity. So we have a whole set of related phenomena of script purism here, which I think should also be seen in parallel with similar tendencies towards language purism, which shows itself first and foremost in the adherence to neoclassical and at times even neo-old Japanese grammar and the native layer of the lexicon. The second aspect besides script purism is what has been termed the regularization of hiragana. That is turning hiragana into something that is both used together with sinographs in regular script and taking on characteristics of regular script itself. While hiragana were usually combined with characters in cursive script, they are now used in these works in conjunction with sinographs in regular script. Like characters in regular script, the hiragana are much more uniform in size than before, and all characters are placed on an imaginary grid with a fixed number of lines per page and a fixed number of characters per line. Hirata again takes this a little further by also abandoning the linking of kana that used to be part and parcel of hiragana for most of its history. What scholars such as Motoori and Hirata are doing can, I think, be described as establishing a hiragana-based but still non-ordinary mode of inscription with models from the remote past, in addition to establishing neoclassical literary Japanese as a language of science, at least some fields of science. So here's an example of what this looks like in the Kojiki then. First, we can see how the text forms a grid on the page, which was still unusual at the time for texts in Japanese, but of course well known from Chinese texts in regular script. Marked in blue here are some of the dakuongana we see in this text for syllables like gu, zu, and a couple of times be. The voiced initials are actually marked in a redundant fashion here, as the usual diacritics are added as well, but this is not always the case, as we will see later on. Finally, there are also a number of other hiragana of note here, which are clearly based on old Japanese models and are quite unusual for hiragana at the time. The situation is quite similar in various publications by Hirata Atsutane and his students. So the grid-like arrangement of the text on the page is even clearer now. We again see a dakuongana here, and there are again rather unusual hiragana based on old Japanese models to be seen. Also note that the selection of such kana is virtually the same as what we have seen in the Kojiki before. Overall, the visuals are quite special though. yeah, and a lot of kana written in a somewhat idiosyncratic way here. And to this, we may add the use of obsolete variants of Chinese characters, which further contribute to the archaic feeling this publication and many others from the same publishing house impart on the reader. Two out of the aforementioned features appear again and again together in text from the late 18th century onwards, namely the use of dakongana, like do, ba, bu, be, and so on, and other rare kana, both of which are best explained as deliberate archaisms. So here's another case, for instance, from a preface Moto-Odi provided for the publication of one of his pupils, and is not too difficult to find similar cases. A recurring theme is also the deliberate use of Old Japanese word forms and grammar as further indicators of a return to the past, but I'll concentrate on the script on the following slides. If we turn to paratexts by other Moto-Odis, so to speak, we see that the tradition lives on here. Again, we find Dakwangana and other kana inspired by Nara period models. The case here is from the 1830s, but it is relatively easy to find more examples in the writings of the better known Moto-Odis in the next decades and into early Meiji times at least. And similar things could be said about Hirata and his successors. So let's also have a look at one such case from early Meiji times. Here, for instance, we see the preface and postscript to a publication by Gonda Naosuke, who had studied under Hirata Atsutane. The two short texts are by authors belonging to the next generation again, both of which had studied under Gonda. Hagiwara's preface on the right features a grid-based arrangement and also quite a few dakongana, but Utsumi's postscript is certainly of greater interest. Even if it maybe doesn't look too unusual at first sight, it contains on a total of only 3 pages about 10 different dakongana and also a variety of further archaisms in terms of kana choice. So as an interim summary, we may note the following points about marked kana as indexes of scholarly identities in late Edo Japan. First, such special selections of kana are typically seen in paratexts. Only at times we find them in the main text of substantial works. Next, it is important to notice that we are dealing with a remarkably stable inventory across authors, spanning about 100 years. And judging from the fact that they can be seen at least until the early 1880s, it seems likely that the widespread use was also the reason for creating dakongana printing types in the early Meiji period, as recently studied by Okada in 2020. While I could only show a small selection of such cases, the use of both dakongana and other rare kana inspired by Old Japanese texts was by far not an isolated phenomenon and not limited to Moto-Odi and Hirata either, but instead it is widely observed for many decades, and at the same time such practices were always closely linked to the circle of national learning scholars. So they really helped identify the background of their users. A somewhat special selection of hiragana is, however, not the only option scholars had to unmistakably identify themselves as having a specific background. So let's also have a look at a few more cases involving paratext and also a couple of personal seals. Now, likely the best way to demonstrate that you're a scholar who is well versed in Old Japanese sources is trying to emulate the language and modes of inscriptions current back then. Our first example here, shown on the left this time, is Tachibana Chikayo's 1807 preface to his widely read commentary on the Manyoshu as one of the chief monuments of Old Japanese literature. It's written in sonographs throughout, but functionally speaking, a lot of these, namely all marked in blue now, are phonograms, or kana in other words. Just like many such prefaces in Neo-Old Japanese, it is in regular script, which was also the most common way to render Old Japanese text. The example on the right shows one of the prefaces to another work by Hirata Atsutane, written by one of his students in 1850. I didn't mark them here, but again, many of the characters are phonograms or kana. This time, however, the text is in clerical script, which is somewhat special. We sometimes do see clerical script in the case of Chinese language prefaces, but it's not necessarily strongly associated with Old Japanese texts. It certainly gives it an even more archaic appearance, though, so that's maybe what's behind it. What is interesting about the print shown here is that some reader added a reading to the entire preface in katakana by hand, which is likely due to the somewhat more challenging way the preface is written. And speaking of challenges, it also quite often happens that such neo-Old Japanese prefaces are written in cursive script, like here on the left in 1862. What we see here is basically nothing else than what we have seen in the previous two examples. The overall mode of inscription is, and also the amount of phonograms or kana is quite similar. The only real difference is that cursive, not regular or clerical script is used. The preface on the right, dating from the same year, 1862, presents a challenge of its own, as it is written in one variety of the many different so-called scripts from the age of the gods, which you find in the writings of certain scholars, especially during the 19th century. The reading in katakana is printed this time, most likely because readers were not even expected to be able to read this without special instruction. This is more of a side note, but there are also cases of pre-existing and well-known texts being rewritten in some variety of these so-called scripts from the age of the gods. One of the most extreme cases is the one shown on the right. This is basically the entire text of the Kojiki, but rewritten here and reprinted in the well-known variety of scripts from the age of the gods, modeled on Korean Hangul, obviously. This is a rather late case, but similar ones are also found in earlier times. For instance, when a selection from the Hyakunin issue was published by the aforementioned, well, actually I didn't mention them, but showed one of his texts, the preface on the last slide on the right by Kojiki, who, yeah, also published a selection from the Hyakunin issue with added commentary that alternates between the same script from the age of the gods as well as hiragana and katakana. It's a somewhat special text, but let's go on. So in the last section of today's talk, I'd like to have a brief look at another area in which script choice is closely tied to a person's identity, namely personal seals. First, some numbers based on the wonderful ownership seal database you can find on online at the address indicated on the slide. Back when I checked these numbers, about 27,000 of the entries in the database came with an indication of the script used on the respective seal. Well, the numbers are a little misleading, maybe, as we're talking about tokens rather than types here. In other words, in the case of major book collectors, you may end up getting dozens of entries for the same seal by the same person. Nevertheless, these numbers should be sufficient to make the point that ownership seals typically feature an inscription in Chinese characters. No surprise here, mostly in seal script or to a lesser degree in regular script. Clerical script or cursive forms occur as well, but are already much rarer. And any sort of script, any other sort of script is exceedingly rare in general and also in this sample. None of this is really surprising, maybe, but it is precisely the unusualness of using any other script that turns such seals into powerful displays of one's identity and intellectual background. So first, we have two seals which may not look very special at all at first sight. And indeed, they're not really special in terms of the script used. It's just sinographs in regular script. They're still a little unusual, however, because all these sinographs are actually phonograms, again, imitating how Old Japanese was written in Mangagana, just like in some of the prefaces we have seen. It goes without saying by now that the persons behind such seals are, again, scholars from the field of national learning. Now let's have a look at some examples featuring Roman and Cyrillic script. The ones in the middle and on the right belong to unidentified persons, but we are arguably dealing with somebody involved in Dutch studies, maybe around the end of the Edo period, and somebody involved in some way or another with Russia and Russian, probably in Meiji times. But the case on the left is a little more sophisticated. The seal belongs to Takashi Kageyasu, a well-known official astronomer. who is also known for his study of and translations from foreign languages, including Dutch. And the seal shows a monogram combining the 4 consonant letters T, K, H, and S with the vowel A at the bottom and the vowel I integrated into the consonant block on the right, so yielding Takahashi. It is obviously based on European models, and it seems likely that it was created with the help or even by some VOC employee. In any case, it was certainly an effective way of identifying yourself as a scholar of Western learning back in the early 19th century, even towards others who were unable to actually read the monogram. Now, we have already seen that some national learning scholars had a weakness for scripts from the age of the gods, so you can imagine what comes next. Right? Seals making use of such scripts. The 2 examples on this slide make use of the same variety of script, but other scholars had different preferences, so there's quite some variation seen in this category. Yeah, there's not really much to say here, but it's maybe interesting to note that the language used here is again archaic on purpose. Thus, instead of aruji, the old Japanese word form aroji is used on the seal on the left side, deliberately, I'm pretty sure. The cases here are straightforward in terms of the text of the respective inscription, but the persons behind the seals are not quite certain. The script used in the case on the left is the same as before, whereas the example on the right takes us back to the varieties of these scripts from the age of the gods that are modeled on Hangul, actually. So to sum up all this very briefly, first, script choice operates both on and below the level of script, and both inter as well as intra script variability may carry sociolinguistic meaning. A second, script choice and language choice has to be considered in tandem, as they do not combine in random ways, but often rather reinforce each other. Third, we have seen that illegibility is potentially a non-issue, as even illegible script may still be effective in creating meaning. Whether you can actually read a seal in Roman script or in one of these scripts from the age of the gods or not, the intellectual background of the seal's owner will still be apparent at a glance. They thus beautifully illustrate the power of script choice to create meaning beyond the bare meaning of a text as such. And lastly, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to all those making all this possible, namely all of the institutions who digitize their pre-modern holdings and make them available online, which is important now more than ever, I guess. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward, yeah, to your comments, Michael. So let me stop the screen share.
Thank you very much for your amazing presentation. It was very interesting to see how the script can affect our perception of the text. And now let's move on to the comment. So Professor FACIUS will present his comment right now. And could you please begin?
Yes.
With sharing your slides.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Sven, for this fantastic presentation and lecture, very rich in detail and in material. And I have a lot of rather big and generic questions and comments for you, so you can basically just see how it relates to your presentation and how you want to react to that. So like I want to divide my comments into 3 parts. I'll ask you like 3 types of questions related to what you presented, script identity in the early modern period. So first of all, the role of Semitic characters and their relationship to identity. Secondly, different levels and types of identity, writer identity and identity of the users of these scripts. And thirdly, the issue of national identity and also relating to Japanese empire building in the period following up the early modern period, which is the Meiji period. So first of all, the lecture focuses mostly on hiragana and katakana and their usages. And you also gave examples of the use of block writing versus cursive writing when it comes to Semitic characters. But you don't talk a lot about like what the variations in function and identity that Semitic characters could have. So I have like 3 questions in this context. So what are other ways of using Semitic characters to express and convey identity in the early modern period? Are there similar variations and claims of identity when you use Semitic characters, when you use particular Semitic characters, when you use a particular font of Semitic characters in the early modern, for example? Secondly, so you showed examples of the paired use of synographs, as you call them in your presentation, with syllabaries in hiragana glosses and different types of mixed writing. One example that you gave is, I think I forgot the name of the title right now of the book that you presented, but it was you had like the characters for Dai Nippon. For example, on the right side you have the hiragana reading Dai Nippon. On the left side you have a reading O Yamato. Right, so you have different identity functions, different ways of using these scripts that kind of have an interplay. This is kind of straightforward, right? One is the conventional Semitic style reading of the characters. The other is more of an explanation for people who wouldn't be able to understand the readings, even if they can like read the hiragana, but who would need a more colloquial explanation. But of course, there are like all kinds of playful ways of using hiragana, these annotations. One example that I thought of is in Yoshiwara, which is the entertainment and pleasure quarter, right? The bunjin, the literati would meet to enjoy themselves, right? And enjoy playing with language and playing with script. And sometimes they would have very high level, you know, kanji-based texts. And then they would use these glosses, hiragana glosses, to add a sense of humor, right? To add a reading that is kind of unexpected, that kind of twists the meaning. This would be one example, but perhaps you have other comments to make on this, like mixed use. And the third question would be the term kanji itself, right? So we've, like I've been using Semitic characters here, you have been using the word sinographs, then there's the usual Japanese term kanji, but of course, in the Edo period, that was not necessarily, it was not a marked thing to be writing in characters necessarily, right? You would have like kana, and then you would have ji mostly. You wouldn't necessarily even say kanji up until the later Edo period. So the term kanji, so Chinese or Semitic characters in itself, would become somehow a mark of identity. And I wonder if you have to say something about this role of, you know, kanji becoming a more marked as a form of script, in contrast to being kind of a universal standard, just like the Latin alphabet, which was not an Italian alphabet in Europe, but a Latin alphabet, right? So the second set of comments is about different levels of identity that you have been explicitly and implicitly alluding to. So the focus of the lecture is, of course, on the variation in script itself. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the people who use them. For example, you mentioned like scholarly identity. So that would be kind of a social class identity that you could demonstrate by using script in a certain way. Then you showed the seals, right? Where people, if they use the script of the gods, right, they could show that they had this kind of very you know, cryptic or or like type of knowledge, or that they would have allegiance to a certain school, for example. But there's also the expression of individual identity, and that's, I think this is especially interesting in the early modern period, because there was no universal standard, right? There was no orthography, no national orthography for writing. So how would people navigate expressing individual identity through script use? But perhaps also, this is something I don't know anything about, it's just something I thought about because we're discussing identity in this series. Like, do you know about some regional variations inside Japan that would be expressed in script? For example, is there something that is more Kyoto style usage of script or Edo style usage of script, or is this something that would be used in Tohoku? I don't know. I don't know anything about it. Perhaps you don't have to say anything about this either. Just a question that I had. And then, of course, there's also institutional variations. that could be used in different schools, right? In literal schools, in the sense of like one domain school in Owari could use a certain type of writing, but also schools in the sense of lineages of teachers that would transfer their knowledge through disciples, such as one thing I know about is the different types of kundoku annotation styles that would have been in use. It would have been in use like Otoko 10, for example, or like in different schools. But perhaps you know of something else. And the fourth question I found very interesting is that you showed how national learning was also creating these cultural Japanese identities through script, and kind of would juxtapose, not necessarily at the beginning, not necessarily explicitly, but like increasingly explicitly juxtapose this Japanese script identity with a Sinitic Chinese script identity, but also perhaps with the Latin character-based script identity, right? The yokomoji, the different, like the vertical versus horizontal writing. There's also this ironic idea that people would create a language purism by going back to a period where the characters, like the kana, would look much less like kana, like something Japanese, but much more like something Chinese, right? Manyogana, instead of like the more cursive hiragana, which are something, could be said to be something very Japanese in contrast. And the last question I have is about national identity and empire. So the lecture focuses on the pre-modern, but of course, the appearance of national learning that you have been talking about foreshadows the creation of modern national identities. That's kind of a long-standing argument, I think, in Japanese studies, like the transition between the early modern and the modern period, to what extent Kokugaku, so the national learning school, was instrumental in creating a national identity in the Meiji period that would be based on Shinto, that would be based on purism, on nativism, on the exclusion of Chinese, and so on. And I wonder to what extent you see a continuity between the Tokugawa and the Meiji period, if you just look at the aspect not of ideology and Shinto and the gods and exclusivism, but just if you look at script use as being kind of promoted by the National Learning School. And in that context, again, also, how was script deployed in the Meiji period for the creation of a national identity by the state, by certain scholars, and what role would kanji play there? Because, I mean, something I know from my research is that there was basically across the Meiji period, there was a debate if kanji should be abolished, both for reasons of their impracticality, because it took so long to learn, but also for the reason of that they are foreign, right, and are not Japanese, and that the Japanese should focus on hiragana and katakana and so on. So if you have to say anything about like the relationship between national identity and script in the Meiji period. And the last question, because I've seen you talk about that some years ago, and I found it very fascinating, if you want to expand a bit on that, how did that intersect with also with empire building in the Meiji period and an East Asian script identity, right? Because Sinitic characters, sinographs, they were in some way used across the region, not just in Japan. So that was a way to both connect Japanese imperial ambitions on the level of language and script to what was already in place in their colonies, like in Korea and in Taiwan, which used Chinese characters, Sinitic characters, but also to impose a certain orthography or impose colonial policies by twisting, changing, adapting, or forcing the users in their colonies to adapt their use of Sinitic characters. So like this level relation between a regional form of script identity and a Japanese imperial form of script identity. These are a lot of big questions, and of course, like, please pick those that you find most stimulating and interesting. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for all these huge issues you have brought up now. Yeah, maybe I should start with the first one, I guess. So interplay between Chinese characters or sinographs, Sinitic characters, whatever we call them, and kana. Yeah, one thing that came to my mind when you gave that example from Yoshiwara, I think, is what you can see in a lot of especially in the second half of the Edo period in literature that is inspired by Chinese models again, but written in Japanese. You could still use quite unusual kanji to write perfectly normal Japanese words. And what makes that possible is the interplay between kana and kanji, because you would have furigana added throughout anyways. So you could use very obscure ways of writing perfectly normal words, because the furigana would still enable the reader to make sense of it. So even if the furigana are deleted, you probably would end up either reading it entirely differently, or maybe you don't understand it at all, because in a lot of cases, it's not based anymore on classical Chinese or Buddhist Middle Chinese, but it's often then based on much more recent forms of Chinese, so-called Baihua literature, and all of that comes in. So you would have, in order to make sense of it, you would have to know a lot of Ming or Qing period literature, which of course some would have had that knowledge, but a lot of readers wouldn't really have had the knowledge. But still, you could use the combination of easy to read furigana making sense of the text, and these, well, maybe even in a way exotic, fashionable looking ways of writing in Japanese in kanji, inspired by more recent forms of Chinese literature. And that's, so language-wise, it's not really that interesting maybe in a lot of cases, but if you look at how it is written, you get a second layer of meaning. Namely, it tells you a lot about the background of the writer, and it tells you about how knowledgeable the writer is in terms of Ming Qing period Chinese literature. So you are the fashionable writer who knows all these cool stuff, and you have all these allusions, at least on the script level, in your Japanese publications, right? So that's certainly one thing that also is something that's quite relevant for the period of time I've been looking at in this talk, even if I didn't mention it because I was more looking on, looking at publications in a more strict, strictly speaking, scholarly sense, and not, I mean, I mentioned certain forms of other forms of literature here and there, but it wasn't really my focus, because there, as you said at some point, there is no standard really, and even in a specific genre or specific context or domain, you can still get quite some variation. And that multiplies by all these different domains you have. So you cannot really cover all of it in, I don't know how many minutes that was. Maybe hopefully close to 30 still. I'm not so sure actually. Okay, so that's maybe one thing. Another thing that's important when we speak about the interplay of Chinese characters and kana is certainly the relative amount of both. So what is the amount of Chinese characters in a text, and what does that do to, what kind of impression does a reader receive by looking at that? Because if you look at popular fiction, certain forms are almost, not quite, but almost free of kanji. So if you think about it in terms of literacy, certain forms of literature could be read by persons who barely know a couple of kanji, but at least know knew their hiragana, right? So that would be the lowest level of literacy that would still enable you to enjoy a lot of works of popular fiction. But if you go to more sophisticated works, you would need a lot of more kanji. And if you go to scholarly works, especially in the field of sinology or Neo-Confucianism and other areas where you were fond of showing off your sinological erudition, then you would get maybe an even higher degree, and not but not just the script, but also connected to language again, because you also tend to use more obscure words in there, right? It's not just all difficult kanji, but sometimes the kanji are not the problem, but the words are not really anything you would use in everyday usage. Maybe much like today in some environments. So again, that's certainly one thing, and this also, yeah, could be if you, for instance, look at letters. I didn't address this here at all, but you could also look at stereotypically male versus stereotypically female letters, and you see a drastic difference in terms of the amount of kanji as opposed to kana. And of course, I don't have to say that, but maybe I should. In the male letters tend to use almost 100% kanji and just a few kana, and female letters are more on the opposite side of the spectrum. And yeah, there are some really nice examples for that, but I didn't really want to address this because it's entirely different issue again, and with another set of problems involved, especially also in terms of accessibility of good primary sources. So I didn't want to do that. So there are definitely a lot of things where you can look at the interplay and what they tell you about the authors, but also about the expected readership. Also in terms of social, like, stratification and degree of education and literacy and all that. But let's let's leave it at that, because you also had two other huge areas. So let's see, different levels of, yeah, or types of identity. One thing that is actually something that is, I don't know how much of it actually yeah, was noticeable in what I presented on some of the slides, but even if we just look again at these national learning scholars, you can clearly see certain lineages, certain schools, and how certain habits of using, for instance, these Dakongana and Old Japanese inspired hiragana, how that spreads. So if you like, if you draw a diagram showing the networks of these national learning scholars, you will see that with every new generation and every time you get new students learning from persons who already used that sort of thing, it spreads from there. So you have the Moto Ori schools through various generations. Actually, it's not just Norinaga, but also Ohira and Uchito and others. And then you have the Hirata school, which again, several generations, many students. And Gonda, as I mentioned, is one of these students of the Hirata school. And his students, again, do the same thing. And so it's really a part of your identity as a national learning scholar, at least from Moto Ori onwards, maybe a little bit earlier, but that's not quite clear yet, to imitate that. So you see what your teachers are doing and what your great teachers are doing, and they demonstrate how you can go, well, take a little bit back from the remote past and integrate it into your modern writing habits. And they all do that. And it only seems to stop, at least it stops to be visible with the beginning of movable type printing. Because movable type printing, I mean, it's sometimes seen as a success, and it's the more modern kind of printing, but it makes it impossible to retain the freedom you had until up until that time. So as I said somewhere in the talk, not just in manuscripts, but also in print, you had almost unlimited freedom. You could do whatever you wanted in writing. Because whatever could be written on paper could be printed easily without having to produce printing types. And that changed drastically in the Meiji period. And then, of course, you get into this entire issue of a standard language and standard writing system. And then you want to reduce variability, and in 1900 you get your like standardized set of hiragana and katakana, and you abandon all these great possibilities you had up until that time. So a lot of diversity you had in the area of writing systems or script use is gone after that. It's not just a lot of people concentrate on linguistic diversity and how it diminishes due to the spread of the standard language. You have these issues with declining dialects and so on. But it's not just language; it's also on the side of the writing system. Okay, but I'm deviating from the main issue here. The main issue was scholarly identities and schools and all that. Regional variation, I don't really know, but in recent years you have this concept of so-called Hogen kanji, so dialect Chinese characters, which is, as far as I'm aware of, mostly about let's say special characters, rare characters that appear mostly in place names. And there you have this regional aspect, of course. And some of them started as errors of some kind, but got established at some point, and from some point onwards, it's just the way to write that name properly. And a lot of these are retained up to the present day. So that's certainly one thing, and that might be also be taken as like if you are from that place using that strange kanji that is only seen in the name of that place, you might use that as an indicator of your regional identity. But I'm not sure if anybody's really doing that. I haven't done any research into that direction, but there are some. If you just Google for Hogen kanji, you will find a couple of publications there that might contain something of interest in that direction. But I'm not sure. In the Edo period, well, it's a bit. The publishing centers are all, most of the time the same, anyways. And I've mostly been looking at printed texts here, even if they look like manuscripts. They're still printed texts all the time, what I've been using here for today. It's not like I'm not looking at manuscripts at all, but at least I cannot think of a good example of like, yeah, this is how you do that in, I don't know, in province A, and this is how it's done in province B. I'm sorry about that. But schools are definitely an issue, and you mentioned Kamun Kundoku and Okoto-ten, and I didn't want to talk about katakana because I didn't have time anyways to go into that, but actually I had a few, maybe one slide about katakana in there as well, but that was not about the Edo period actually, so I dropped it. That would have been about the beginnings of katakana in the Heian period, because in the Heian period there is no single unified inventory of katakana, but you have lots of different, you have different temples, you have different sects, you have different schools, you have transmission from teacher to pupil, and you have a lot of variation and a lot of individual variation. So almost every manuscript from the 9th and 10th centuries, for instance, has its own set of katakana. So it's a very individual thing. It's something that only changes in the second half of the Heian period, where you have more exchange between different temples and different script users, and it ceases to be a personal, a very individual thing, and you get this more like a not quite, but more like a standardized, or let's say conventionalized set of katakana. And this also goes hand in hand with these different systems of Okoto-ten, which are also almost every temple, or at least, well, sometimes related temples use the same system, but you have a lot of variation, and it's also used not only to mark your own identity maybe, but to keep it from others. And it's also, of course, a means of demarcation from others, right? But that's not really the case anymore in the late Edo period, because katakana is almost without any variations at that time. And that's maybe also one of the reasons why hiragana was preferred, because you had, even up until 1900, you have a huge amount of variation within hiragana, right? Which you didn't have anymore in katakana since the end of the Heian period. So if you want to go for something special, you want to add individual personal flavor to your hiragana use, to your kana use, you would go for hiragana because it's much easier to do it there because it was there anyways. You could just add to the variation and add to the complexity. Why not? I mean, it's fun. So yeah, let me see.
Thank
yeah, you
you.
mentioned. Oh, yeah, maybe I should stop here. Okay, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
I'm
I couldn't
sorry.
even. No. You're absolutely right, and it's you're the one in charge. So thank you for stopping me.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much for your amazing discussion, and thanks for listening to our language and identity series. Goodbye.